Today, I'm happy to answer some of your questions that came in from my 3,000 subscriber giveaway that just ended yesterday. So here's question number one. Do you have specific things that you do to get through composer's block at any stage of the process? So part of the way I tackle this question is actually to not label what you just said as a type of writer's block. I don't really believe in that term. What do I mean by this? When I sit down to write, I for sure know I'm going to block out 2 hours on this day, 2 hours on this day, 2 hours on this day, 2 hours on this day. I actually did that this week when I was blocking out time to write my new piece for the California Symphony. I said, okay, I know generally speaking, it's going to take me X amount of hours to finish this piece, and I'm going to block out this amount of time on these days, on these times. I'm going to write this piece. And I tell myself, it's okay. I already block in that writer's block that you're talking about. It's okay if I have a few days or even a week or two of not writing anything down. I consider that as all part of the process. So, in a way, I'm kind of like putting this writer's block into the amount of time that I'm writing the piece. I don't call it writer's block, I call it a part of the process. So, for example, if I end up writing 1 minute of music that day, that's great. But if I don't write any music for the rest of the week, I don't call that writer's block. I just call it part of the process. So I think with composers, because we're kind of just in this sphere all by ourselves, writing without much input from others, it's really easy to be self critical that, oh my God, I'm not writing any music. But if you just kind of flip that around, say, hey, actually having some writer's block, it's not really a block. It's actually part of the process of composing itself. So in that way, I don't really feel like, especially in the last few years, that I've ever came across like a huge period of the year not writing any music because I just consider those few weeks of me not writing when I'm supposed to be writing part of the process. So I think it's a mental thing more than actually not having any ideas because not having any ideas, I think, is part of the process. Great question. Going to question number two. Did any of your performances or compositions flop? What was that like and how did you recover? Well, I kind of have a self-critical bent to me that almost every one of my performances, I feel that could have done something better after every single one. I'm trying to get better at that. I'm trying to say, I did that. That is the best piece that I could have written in that time period, and try not to kind of think to myself too critically, because I feel like that just is really bad, especially for your mental health and actually moving on to the next piece. Because I think that the whole goal of writing music is writing music for a lifetime, like enjoying the process for the lifetime, whether you're doing music as a career or as a hobby. Okay. So I don't really think of my compositions as failures or as even huge successes. I just am happy every time I get a piece done and have it performed. So the question about flopping, it depends what you mean. Do you mean flopping from the audience perspective? Do you mean flopping from my perspective? Because I have to say, when you have a performance, especially in a concert music setting, audiences are generally pretty polite. I mean, they're usually going to clap after every performance of one of your works. I do have to say that there was one time when one of my performances actually really did truly flop, but it was not really a typical performance that I usually have. It was way back in high school when I had my high school graduation. And I wrote this piece for a quartet of our high school, some high school band and string orchestra students. And it wasn't really a flop in the sense of something that I did particularly wrong, but we had a keyboard like this out in the main lawn while we were doing the ceremony. And we were going along playing the piece and the piece that I wrote for the ceremony. And about 5 to 10 seconds in, the battery for the keyboard just totally died. So we were missing an entire part, and this keyboard part had basically all the accompanimental things going on. So if you want to say a flop, I mean that was certainly a flop, and we barely got any applause after that piece. So I was pretty down about that, but then I got up, went went into the stands, and then I went ahead and graduated high school. So that for me, that was, if you want to call a flop, that right there was a flop for you. All right, moving on then. Do you often conduct your own pieces? And if so, what challenges do you have with conducting as well as making notes and comments? Okay, for the last 10 years or so, I haven't conducted any of my music. I actually prefer the conductors to conduct the music and me to kind of sit back and relax. This is pretty common, I have to say, in the concert music world, and it's actually quite common in the film music world too. I see that happening a lot. I also see composers like John Adams or Thomas Adès, people like that, or even Esa-Pekka Salonen, conduct and compose their own works. I don't like to conduct at all. Number one, I feel like it kind of takes the sense of ownership from whoever is conducting that gig because I'm not going to conduct the Beethoven or the Brahms or something else on that gig. Because if I'm conducting a piece, usually they want the conductor to conduct the entire program, not just the piece that they wrote. So it's a logistical thing. And the other thing is, I just don't like to personally travel around everywhere week to week. I like kind of being here in my home studio. I like going to Columbia to go teach. And I like to have I have kind of my own routine going on every day. So to kind of pack up and go and conduct here and conduct there, to me, that's not very conducive to the kind of lifestyle I want. But I do have to say, I did used to conduct my own pieces, and that was back when I was at USC, where I was really pursuing film music pretty much for a good portion of 2 or 3 years that I was there. And I did conduct basically every single film score that I had there. And that was more, again, a logistical, practical reason because I had just written that music like the week before, because film music is a very fast turnaround. And I needed to just make sure everything was going right. There was no time to give it to a conductor, have the conductor look at it, have the conductor study it, etc. So that was a very kind of like practical reason for that going on. What usually happens with the conductor, by the way, just so that you know, is that a conductor would make most of their notes and comments before the first rehearsal. So when you see these conductor scores, they're often lined up. They have all these different color markings, blue, red, yellow, all this kind of stuff going on. They have meter markings. They circle cues of big entrances that are happening in the orchestra. So the conductors are actually very, very prepared before the whole thing starts. And in my opinion, it's the job of the composer, especially if it's a premiere, to kind of sit back, have the score in front of himself or herself, and make comments himself or themselves. I think a conductor and a composer, for whatever reason in the public eye, there people kind of equate them as being the same person. Oftentimes I get called a conductor. Sometimes I hear conductors being called composers. I actually like having them be separate entities altogether. That way I could focus more on the composing. I don't have to travel around every other week conducting Beethoven and whoever else. The next question here is about picking the right instruments for small ensembles. So the question here is how to get better at navigating the balance between not too weird that no one will ever play it and maybe not just another string quartet. I've definitely had situations where I wanted to have like an extra instrument that is not typical of that instrumentation. And I usually have like a very strong reason why I'm having an instrument in that kind of particular setup. For example, I just wrote this piece. I haven't posted it here on this channel called Selig Liegt, which is a piece called Saving Light in German. And this was premiered in the Gdamis Festival this past summer. And with this particular piece, it was for Perot Ensemble, which is violin, cello, flute, clarinet, piano, and percussion. And typically, the percussion part usually has a lot of different percussion stuff going on. But for this particular piece, I wanted to use a zarb, which is a type of Persian drum. I really felt it was important that I use the zarb, not just because it was kind of an ethnic sound or whatever you want to call it, but I was using it in such a way where it was controlling the entire form of the piece from the very beginning to the very end. So I was very critical to make sure that that instrument was not just something that was evoking a sound, like being transported to another world, because I don't think that's enough to use that particular instrument, but to use it as part of a temporal kind of oral argument, which I did in that piece. So hopefully, some weeks or months down the line, I'll be able to show you that particular piece. So, in summary, I think you kind of have to have a balance about it. That particular piece I wrote, it was a typical kind of standard instrumentation. It was a Perot ensemble, but I put a little bit of an extra different instrument in there just to kind of change up the setup. So it doesn't mean you have to write for, string quartet all the time. But if you want to write for string quartet and then maybe have the string quartet players play like the kazoo or something, you can do something like that. Something like, for example, George Crumb's Black Angels does really well with the string quartet setup. So there are things that you can do to kind of spice up the regular instrumentation, especially I feel like when you're starting out as a composer or don't have much experience, you kind of do want to write for these kind of standard ensembles. That way you kind of have an idea of, okay, this is how a group functions together. If you kind of just put random instruments together, guess what? Those people that are playing those instruments probably never played together before. So a string quartet, at least these four people that you recruit to play, they've actually probably played together a bunch of times. and you'll see what a working rehearsal will look like with a string quartet. So those are a couple of ways you can navigate it. I hope that answered your question. And our last question is, what is your piece of advice to graduate student composers who are not studying at Ivy League institutions and usually their resources are much limited? So I have to say, with this particular question, the only resources I would say that are a lot more in terms of the relationship between an Ivy League institution like Columbia University or Princeton University or Harvard University, etc., are the resources in terms of the funding, the direct funding they provide the students that are pursuing like a DMA or PhD degree at an Ivy League institution. Other than that, as long as they're high performing musicians at whatever graduate institution that you are going to, you should be able to put together a group of musicians every few months to play your music. I mean, that's really what the whole point of being at a graduate institution is. The big thing about being at an Ivy League, of course, is the resources they provide directly to the student composers that are going there. That being said, the money that they do provide, for example, my stipend at Columbia was in the range of 35,000 every single year. This on the surface, especially if you're living in Manhattan, is not really that much money, but at least it is kind of a basis for you to kind of build upon. You don't have to rely on making 60, 70, $80,000 a year just from doing music on its own. And if you want to talk about specific non-Ivy League type programs, the University of Iowa is one that comes to my mind because they have a residency, an ongoing residency with the Jack Quartet, which is one of the biggest, string quartets in the world as far as playing contemporary new classical music. So if you're a graduate student composer there, I would assume that if you had a string quartet ready by the time the Jack Quartet arrives, you'd be able to have a reading session with them. I would actually be very curious to hear in the comments down below from anybody from a non-Ivy League university doing a graduate degree in composition. That's a lot of specific things, but I would be actually very curious. What are some of the resources that you feel that your school does a really good job at providing? Please leave those down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for sending in those questions. And now it's time to actually spin the wheel and figure out who won this license of Piano Tech Pro. This is really exciting. I've never gave away anything in my life, but here we go. This is what we're going to do. So we have 24 names here, and I'm just going to spin the wheel here. So here we go. Oh my goodness, it's going, it's going, it's going, it's going, it's going, and congratulations to Bjorn to Run. Bjorn to Run. You are the winner of the Piano Tech Pro license. So please do reach out to me to get your license of Piano Tech Pro. This is really exciting. I hope you enjoy it. And thank you guys so much for watching this video. Until next time.